Hi, so I just finished reading your abstract, and it looks like you have a lot of great information here about your research. But as a reader, I'm still a little unclear of how what you're studying and experimenting on fits into the larger conversation in your field. And a helpful strategy for researchers to make the significance and the novelty of their research known to a reader like me are the novelty moves. And I think it would be helpful to look at a handout so that we can better understand what they are and some examples of how they can work and improve an abstract. So here is the handout, and this is how we can establish novelty with 4 rhetorical moves. So researchers use 4 moves to show how their work is important, relevant, and new. So first, to do this, we have to explain the significance. So this would mean explaining why someone would care about this research. And even if you think it's immediately apparent to you or someone you work closely with why this would be significant in your field, it can be helpful to think about why this is significant to the general public. What contribution is this having that would be significant to someone outside of your field? And this will help you contextualize the issue. And it could just be that the issue is current, that a lot of people are talking about it. That's one way you can explain the significance. Then we want to get into describing the status quo. And so what this means is describing the current or conventional practices that are being used by researchers within the defined or limited scope of your field. So this would mean reviewing current practices, literature, or state of affairs. So citing some previous research and noting what has been established in this field, what is currently being said about the issue that you're going to be looking at. Then the third move is identifying a gap in the status quo. So here you would show that the current practices or state of research, or the status quo, in your field are incomplete in some way, or unsatisfactory or inconclusive, and most importantly that they demonstrate a need for this gap to be filled. So a really common way to signal that there is a gap in the research is the word however. So when you use that term, the reader will know that although this has been established, the status quo is saying this, however, there remains more questions to be answered, more things to be developed in this field, and that would be a gap where current research has failed to acknowledge or neglected to consider. So that brings us to the fourth move, which is where you would fill that gap with your present research. So this means that you would show how your current research or research proposal is a timely, necessary, or innovative solution to effectively fill the existing gap. And if you're not sure how your research is filling a gap, try to think about how it could be new or novel in one or more of these ways. So it could be a new theory or hypothesis, and this could mean explaining a shortcoming in the existing theory to set up a new hypothesis completely. Or is it a new solution, proposing a solution to an existing problem or unresolved controversy? And in this, you have to explain the problem and make sure that is known and why your solution is better than other solutions when compared to the other solutions that are already out there. Or it could be a new methodology, and this would involve critiquing the methodology of previous studies or current studies in the field and suggest your improved methodology, and again, make it clear what is the improvement. Or it could be an entirely new domain where you investigate a previously unstudied population, site, material, or other phenomenon. And just a little note here is to try to, when framing the gap in the research, framing it in a positive light. So maybe, like I said earlier, I said failed. Maybe instead of failed, like more think about it in while X pioneered this field or made this discovery, my work contributes, it supplements, it investigates this in a new way, making sure to frame your contributions in a positive light, and I'm sure that will be better received. So while these moves do not represent they do represent the overall trajectory of an introduction to a research article, you can kind of see it almost funnels down into your specific gap from the larger significance, the current research, the gap, and how you fill that gap. It doesn't necessarily have to be so linear in this way. Some people, they might need more time to explain the status quo and might identify a gap there and switch back and forth, but try to limit yourself with how much you're switching back and forth, because excessive movement can confuse readers. So try to keep it within these moves. And if you're wondering how you might implement these, here are some examples where we can see them in action. So here in the first example, let's see how they establish significance. So in their first sentence, they say peptic ulcer disease is a chronic disease characterized by frequent recurrences. So here they're establishing significance by defining the nature of the disease in that it recurs frequently, and this really establishes it as a current issue that we should care about. And here in the status quo, they say recent studies have suggested that the eradication of this infection affects the natural history of duodenal ulcer disease such that the rate of recurrence decreases markedly. So what's really important to note about how they're introducing the status quo is they're using this phrase, recent studies have suggested. And so this signals to the reader that there has been previous published research about this, and this is what it has found. So this is giving us the current conversation about what this disease is doing. And so moving into how they created a gap in this status quo, they then go on to say, however, the interpretation of these results has been complicated by the fact that several of the larger studies did not use control groups or any form of blinding. In addition, studies of the effect of this H. pylori eradication in patients with gastric ulcer have not been done. So this word here, however, is really important to signal to the reader that you're moving from what has already been established to what is still bringing about questions and what is still open for more investigation. So here it's the fact that it's been complicated that they did not use control groups or blinding, and that the studies in patients with gastric ulcer have not even been done. So this shows to me as the reader that this is what their research will be focusing on. And here, as they present that to me, when they fill the gap, they say, we report the results of a randomized controlled trial in which we have evaluated the effect of therapy designed to eradicate H. pylori on the pattern of ulcer recurrence in patients with duodenal or gastric ulcer. So this phrase here, we report, it signals to the reader that they are moving into what their research is bringing to this conversation. So now you can see a little more clearly how we move from the significance of the issue, that this is a chronic disease, and that recent studies have suggested this, but however, there are clearly still gaps in this research that we can look into, and this is what we report. The results of these randomized controlled trials that evaluate the effect of therapy. So we can clearly see how their findings fit into the larger conversation, and I can more readily contextualize and interpret this information, and it's more helpful to me. So let's look at a second example to see how another author would use these same novelty moves. So to establish significance, in their first sentence they say, although plastic has revolutionized modern life, the environmental impact of traditional petroleum plastics is staggering. So here they establish the significance by having this claim about plastic revolutionizing modern life that immediately impacts me as a reader. And they go on to note the impact of plastic on the environment and its staggering impact. So this is clearly implicating me as a reader and identifying that this is an important issue that has very large effects. And moving into how they define their status quo, they say bioplastics may provide a sustainable alternative to petroleum plastics because they use fewer fossil fuels in production and reduce greenhouse gas emissions as they biodegrade. One particularly promising bioplastic is polylactic acid. Polylactic acid resembles traditional plastic and can be processed on equipment already used for petroleum plastics. So here in their status quo, they're giving me contextual information on bioplastics and what has already been established about them. So what are already some advantages about them? What is this PLA? They're giving me these contextual information and terms that really orient me to what is currently going on and being said in the field. And then when they move to create a gap, they again use the same term as our other example. However, the commercial viability of PLA is currently limited because it is only compostable in industrial facilities and cannot be mixed with other recyclable materials. So their gap here is noting that its viability is limited. And this is an area where they see their research fitting into. And to move into filling this gap, they say, to make PLA more commercially viable, we propose a device that composts PLA and other bioplastics within a home composting environment. Such a device, we argue, would encourage the production of a more sustainable and economic bioplastics. So here again, we see this similar phrase to we report, we propose to fill the gap. So this signals to the reader that again, we're moving from what has already been established, what remains to be explored, into this is what we have found, this is what we want to contribute to the conversation. So these were some examples to see these moves in action and how they can look in a real text. So in thinking about your abstract, I think what was missing for me reading it was that contextualization and seeing how the research that you're bringing to the table, how it contributes to this larger conversation. And that's how I like to think of these novelty moves, is thinking of how what you're going to say in a conversation brings what it brings to the existing conversation and discussion about this issue. So yeah, take a look at the handout again, and I think you'll see that if you try to follow those moves and using some of those key words like however and we propose, you'll find that your readers will be better oriented to your argument and have a better idea of how it fits into the larger conversation and why it's significant for us to look into.